Very happy to be here.
Oh, we're very happy too. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Beth Gallagher. Thank you so much for joining. We're just going to wait another minute or two for additional participants to log in. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining, this is Beth Gallagher. Thank you so much. We're just going to wait another minute while additional participants log in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Beth Gallagher from Investor Advocates for Social Justice. We've got a good group on the line today. Thank you so much for making the time and joining us for the webinar today, Strategies for Bringing Laudato Si to Life. Just to let you know, we are recording the webinar and that's active and we're recording now. And I'm going to turn to Sister Carol DeAngelo.
Thank you, Mary Beth. So good afternoon and welcome to this Season of Creation webinar, Strategies for Bringing Laudato Si to Life. Before we formally begin, I would like to make a few logistical announcements. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees. And we will have a question and answer period towards the end of this 1 hour webinar. So we would like to ask people to just take a moment now to locate where your raise your hand, where the hand button is. So you go to participants, you click on participants, and then in the right-hand corner, you'll see the symbol raise your hand. So we are asking that if you have a question at the end of this webinar, you raise your hand and you will be called upon. Now, if we have so many questions, what we're asking is you type that question into the chat box, and then we will try to answer all questions that have not been answered via email. We are asking only for clarification questions as we go along. So if, as the presenters are talking, you have a question for clarification, please type it into the chat box, and we'll be keeping an eye on the chat box so we can address those as we move along on this webinar. And we are very mindful. We want to keep this webinar to as close to an hour as possible. So I'd like to just give a little bit background. So you'll notice in this next slide that representatives of 3 groups that are pictured in this slide, representatives from these 3 groups collaborated in planning today's webinar. Religious organizations along the river, we call it ROAR, Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement, and Investor Advocates for Social Justice. We thought that during this Laudato Si anniversary year and season of creation, this webinar might be of interest and provide an opportunity to listen and think about possibilities for additional ways to learn and collaborate. For those who might not be familiar with all 3 groups, I want to mention that all of us are involved in responding to Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. All three groups try to live into and act from an integral ecology perspective. And many, though not all, are members of the Investor Advocates for Social Justice. I'd like also to mention that connections and networking already exist among us. ROAR and Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement have promoted each other's conferences and activities. We are all involved in raising awareness, advocacy, and systemic change. So hopefully this picture will give you an opportunity to just catch a glimpse of some of the different activities that these groups have done. So as we go on to this next slide, I just want to mention a few words of what integral ecology might be considered. And these are some hopes for this time of sharing together. Integral ecology is a concept not easily grasped, much less put into practice. The silo mentality and approach, rather than seeing all things as related and interconnected, is still a dominant way of thinking and acting in our culture. I think I can say that members of ROAR, Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement, and Investor Advocates for Social Justice are strong advocates for breaking down the silo mentality and strengthening the relationships and connections that we need to build the civilization of love Pope Francis calls us to in Laudato Si. The vision and imperative of Laudato Si is to live and act into integral ecology. Paragraph 138 speaks to the interrelationship between ecosystems and between the various spheres of social interaction, demonstrating yet again that the whole is greater than the part. And we also read in the next paragraph, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. So we hope that new insights might surface for all of us today as we listen to Brighton speak to his experience in environmental justice, and Mary Beth and Jillianne on Investor Advocates Social Justice's initiatives that address the interconnectedness of human rights, climate and racial justice, health, and COVID-19. All our groups are aware of how interrelated environmental, economic, and social issues are, and how all three areas contribute to systemic poverty, war, violence, and injustice, and to the most pressing issue of our day, climate crises. I'll just say a few words on ROAR for those not familiar with it. So we have this next slide. And maybe as I speak, you just want to take a glance at what's there. Because on the right side, we have our mission statement, which states what we believe. We also show how impelled by our beliefs and concerned about this time imperative, why we come together. And then on the left side, we have certainly the website that you're free to visit, and that I think Jillianne might be typing into the chat box. But in the box on the left-hand side are some of the issues that we've addressed over these years and that we continue to address. So ROAR is composed of about 16 women and men religious congregations, and ROAR representatives meet 4 times a year. In this time of COVID-19, we will meet via Zoom the end of October. And one of our agenda items will be to take the learnings and insights from this webinar and see where and how relationships, connections, and collaboration among us might be strengthened. After our presenters speak, Jillianne McGinnity, a member of Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement Steering Committee, will say a few words about that group. So I am so happy now to turn this webinar over to Brighton Kaoma, who is a US-based Zambian social entrepreneur, radio innovator, and climate activist. Brighton will give us an overview of environmental justice and frame some of the impacts we are looking to address through our advocacy work and commitment to integral ecology. Welcome and thank you, Brighton, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Caroline. Sister Carol, very excited to be part of this conversation. Also, thank you so much, Mary Beth, and then the entire team, including Jillianne, for all the support and invitation, most importantly. As introduced by Sister Carol, my name is Brighton Kaoma. I am from Zambia, but currently living in New York City. Just fresh from Columbia University, where I majored in environmental science and policy, with concentration in public administration. So my conversation with you today is going to focus primarily on what I feel lived environmental justice means, but also that is going to be anchored on my lived experiences and what I think is critical for us to think about, especially at a time like this, when we see so many divides. We see a huge divide between self and nature, which includes resilience and ecological recovery. We also see a huge divide between self and others, where we are seeing a lot of hurt in society. We're seeing a lot of racism and discrimination. But we also see a huge divide between self and self, between ourselves and our souls and our spirits, and how we connect to what really makes us human. So next slide. So I was born and raised in a small town in the northern part of Zambia called Kitwe. So to just give you a context of what this looks like, imagine being born in a community where there are no tarred roads, no piped water. So as a household of 5 children, what you depend on entirely on a daily basis is the natural resources. So growing up in a community of about 500,000 people, we had a river which passed through the community. We had arable land where we could farm and grow crops. We also had many other common goods that would share as a community. So we began seeing certain things change. And these things changed not because the community itself started changing things, but because there were some legacy environmental liabilities we began seeing. And what we started observing was the unfair treatment and unmeaningful engagement of all people, especially people like myself and the community in which we grew up. So as seen in the slides, this began happening. We started seeing the lifeblood of our community, which was a river upon which women depended to irrigate their vegetables and make an income. The same lifeblood upon which people depended for fish as a form of protein, being polluted with sulfuric acid, which is used in the refinery of minerals. So all that to say, copper mines, investors, huge investors from the international community started establishing copper mines to mine minerals out of the earth. And we would see land being degraded, the air being contaminated because of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. When walking to school, there were moments where you get choked by sulfur dioxide, but we didn't really understand what was going on. Our thinking was, it's just the usual way we would see someone burning in their backyard and smoke is emitted in the atmosphere. Little did we realize that all those fumes were impacting the physical well-being of children. Things started becoming clearer when we realized that there was a surge in uptake of health services across health communities in the community. So the challenge came in when, as can be seen, children will go and play in areas where toxic materials were dumped by textile industries and big copper mines. And as you might know, in the process of mining, whether you're mining lead or copper, and in the case of lead, central Zambia became one of the most polluted towns in the world, with so many coverages by The Guardian and many other press institutions highlighting these challenges. So as a young child in my teenage years, I realized that I think it's important to make sure that there's meaningful engagement of the community. First, by allowing them to understand that there are certain things happening both to our natural environment, but also to our physical well-being, which have been introduced through external economic factors. So this is what I'm going to speak about in my next slide. So we started seeing things like Vedanta, a very huge investor, global investor, polluting water bodies upon which people depended for irrigation, for growing their crops, and to just living a more decent and dignified lifestyle. Next slide. So through the use of radio, which is the most inexpensive, easy to use and accessible medium, we decided to start getting into approaches that could allow us to hold leaders to account. So this community, which is in northern Zambia, was one of the affected communities, and a huge investor in the extractive industry was sued in the Supreme Court, and through advocacy and community mobilization and strong voices from the community, there was victory. So the case went in favor of the community. And then the challenge is, what now happens when financial means are not enough to compensate the health challenges that people have ended up facing as a result of legacy environmental liabilities? Next slide. So my approach was, if radio was the most meaningful medium of engagement at community level, why can't we use it to build a momentum of young people in the community to rally behind ways through which we can promote justice in the community, ways through which we can promote fairness and meaningful engagement of all people, regardless of their race, color, national origin, income, gender, with respect to development, while abiding by the tenets of environmental justice. So then I started using radio when I was 14 to educate the community in a language in which they understood, to start taking strong action on issues regarding sustainability and ecological recovery, because this was a matter of life and death. It was a matter of survival. Because imagine if all you do when you wake up on a daily basis is growing vegetables and using water from a stream to irrigate. If all you do is making sure that there is enough fish stock in the river near you for you to earn an income through fisheries. If all those life support systems are now being impacted because of economic activities, then it becomes a matter of life and survival for you. So the approach was using low-cost communication technology to raise awareness in the community. So what I did was bring the community to one table, bring leaders in businesses, especially in the extractive industry, to one table, and bring experts from the university to interpret science data into a language that communities understood. And at that time, I was still in my teenage years, 14, 15, and I was still getting to understand what climate science is and what justice means. But I saw that despite being a child, if things are not consistent, you understand. Intuitively, you know that things are not right. This is not what I saw when I was 8 or 7. Things have begun changing. So for me, it was as a result of realizing that people, first of all, need to be educated. For them to be engaged in taking action and realizing that something is wrong, they need to be exposed to all the fractures in society. And my only way of doing this was using a medium that could enable them to gain the knowledge and also gain the understanding of what was going on. So then fast forward, I started focusing more on environmental justice at national level in Zambia by working with government to ensure that they enforce the extended polluter responsibility, where each producer in the country, be it beverage companies or any other textile companies, took responsibility of the end of life of the product. So if you buy a can of juice and there's a disposable cup, the focus was to ensure that the manufacturers take an extended responsibility beyond the lifetime of that product. So then my focus was on that, and we made government enact legislation that could allow companies, especially corporate institutions in the manufacturing industry, to take action. But again, I realized that we needed to mobilize more to make sure that there's fair treatment and meaningful engagement of all people with issues of justice and fairness and equity. So in collaboration with some friends, I co-founded an organization that now mentors young people, specifically children below the ages of, I would say young people because there are others are in their early 20s. And we give them skills in radio broadcasting and production to go in the community, collect stories about people's interaction with the natural environment, go to government institutions, ask them to clarify on what people are reporting in the community, and package all this in a half-hour radio magazine, which is broadcast to over 2 million people. But beyond Zambia, I then got engaged as the Global Youth Ambassador for an organization called Children's Radio Foundation. And we are now training over 3,200 young people as climate radio broadcasters in Southern Africa, giving them skills to express themselves, but also reporting ethically and transparently on environmental justice issues in their communities. But what these things have taught me is that we need to give a voice to the community, but we need to do that in a more engaging and comprehensive way. And we need to use very low-cost approaches to ensure that the communities feel engaged and that they also feel a part of whatever we are advocating. So all that to say, communication has been that conduit I've been using for a very long time to help communities understand all the legacy environmental liabilities, but also working with government at both national and global levels to ensure that there's more ecological recovery and that we break down the jargon, which sometimes makes communities not to be engaged in any way. But the common mantra, as Sister Carol said earlier, something that really made me get involved in what I do even now is realizing that I live a life of purpose. And every day when I wake up, I need to work towards making the life of the next person more meaningful. Because caring for a common home requires that every member of that particular household realizes that it's their responsibility to take action. And a member of this common household called Planet Earth includes business, includes the academia, includes the community, but also includes all of us in this webinar who care the most about what is important. And when we have a chance to express ourselves, and when we have a chance to point at something wrong, we should go for it and never hesitate, because that's when justice begins. When we can stand up for what we believe in, but also ensure that we speak and voice out for those that are marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much, Brighton. Thank you. I just couldn't help but think of Laudato Si and that whole idea of the dialogue among the generations and the conversation and giving voice to the people who really are experiencing the situation. So thank you for this, and I look forward to questions that might be coming in our sharing. So thank you. So Mary Beth and Jillianne, we are very happy to have you share. Jillianne is the program associate, Mary Beth Gallagher, the executive director of Interfaith Advocates for Social Justice. And we are glad that this collaborative webinar has come to be. So thank you for all your work and for bringing to us how you're putting integral ecology into practice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carol. Hi, everyone. This is Mary Beth Gallagher speaking. The Executive Director of Investor Advocates for Social Justice, as Carol mentioned, and I'm going to share a little bit about our work and weave together some of the connectedness between what Brighton just shared about his personal experience in Zambia and the work that we can do as investors, as shareholders, to try to live out with that purpose of holding each of ourselves accountable and engaging with the companies we're shareholders in to hold them accountable as well. So I'll just give a brief overview of Investor Advocates for Social Justice. Many of you on the line are likely familiar with our work. We are a nonprofit organization originally founded as the Tri-State Coalition for Responsible Investment. We went through an organizational strategic transition about this time last year and changed our name. And here you see before you our mission, which is to advocate on behalf of a community of investors whose faith-based values promote human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and the common good. And our purpose as an organization is really to help our community to connect their mission and values with the way they invest their pension funds of their congregations. All of our members are primarily Catholic institutional investors in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, but well beyond that as well. And our work is to serve as an implementing partner to help carry out shareholder advocacy work, partner with other investors in communities like the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, ICCR, and other coalitions for responsible investment. Our purpose today is to give more color to our work and help really to invite you to see the connections between the shareholder engagement work that we do with companies and the work that you may be doing in your own roles, whether you're a justice promoter working on the Hudson River, or you're an NGO representative at the United Nations in the Mining Working Group, or you're based in California seeing the impacts of the wildfires and refineries around the globe. We really want to help build bridges between our work as investor advocates and the work of the congregations to help really amplify our power and the potential to realize the vision of our work, which is an equitable economy where investors leverage their collective voice and resources to advance social, economic, and environmental justice. I want to share a little bit more about the investor strategies that we use. We are really looking at the intersection of mission and values for religious institutional investors and the investment assets. So our organization doesn't manage money, but we support our affiliates in looking at the strategies they use to analyze companies. So environmental, social, and governance factors as they relate to their investment decision-making. We participate in many dialogues with corporate executives. That's really meetings with companies. Most of this work happens by conference call. Our organization engages approximately 55 companies each year, meeting with them between 2 and 4 times a year with a specific agenda and a really pragmatic approach towards raising up areas of concern and encouraging companies to take responsible action. If the dialogue is making some progress, but we feel like additional pressure or visibility on the issue is necessary, we file a shareholder proposal, which is voted on at a company's annual meeting. It's a statement of 500 words or less with a specific ask, and all investors vote on this. And it's an opportunity to elevate our issues before a company's board. We conduct proxy voting on shareholder proposals and other issues, like the board of directors. We attend annual shareholder meetings. We write investor letters. We support public policy that's calling for clear regulatory expectations of companies, whether on issues of environmental justice or climate mitigation or responsible use of surveillance. And many investors have screens or will divest from sectors or businesses that are inconsistent with their mission and values. We have 3 primary initiatives at this stage. One is our Shifting Gears initiative, where we're engaging human rights with companies in the automotive industry. So this touches on issues of labor conditions, forced labor and child labor in the mining sector, really like issues of harassment and discrimination in manufacturing, and encouraging companies to have a responsible approach to understanding and addressing the human rights impacts of their business. We have an initiative on racial justice, where we're encouraging companies to identify the ways that their business practices or their hiring practices disparately impact communities of color, and we encourage companies to have responsible practices and to really put in place systems that end systemic racism. And finally, the campaign we're going to speak about today is on climate and dignity. Jillianne will go into further detail on this, where we're really trying to encourage companies to make a transition to a zero carbon economy while centering human rights and integral ecology. And the impact of our work really takes a lot of different forms. The primary goal is to change corporate practice and change investor practice. So we encourage companies to adopt human rights policies. In the last year, we've worked with companies providing input on their policies. And with our Shifting Gears initiative, we've seen at least 3 companies adopt a human rights policy, 2 companies undertake a comprehensive human rights impact assessment. Many of the companies we're engaging increase their disclosure on human rights so that investors and community stakeholders are able to better understand how companies are addressing the impacts of their business. And we also raise awareness. So among the general population with other investors, and try to encourage a connection between stakeholder capitalism that really puts human rights and equity and justice at the center of the economy, rather than primarily focusing on short-term shareholder value. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Jillianne, and we invite each of you to join us in our work. We collaborate with many of you through different platforms like ROAR and in the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and invite you to learn more about our work. With that, I'll transition to you, Jillianne.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that great background. And like Mary Beth mentioned, I'm going to share about our new initiative, Climate and Dignity. And I'm going to start off by kind of outlining the problem we're trying to address, which Brighton framed in a really powerful way in his presentation. And that is that a safe, healthy, and just environment serve as a prerequisite for enjoying all human rights, which means that the climate crisis is a really significant threat to the rights of billions of people all around the world. And it's very clear that impacts from climate change and pollution are not distributed equally. Burdens often fall on those who contributed least to the problem and are least equipped to deal with the consequences. And this is a manifestation of integral ecology. And so the key underlying themes to this problem we have found are inequality and systemic racism. Communities of color have higher exposure rates to air pollution than white communities. In the US, studies have found that air pollution is disproportionately caused by white Americans through consumption of goods and services, but disproportionately breathed in by Black and Hispanic communities. And after 3 decades, studies have shown that the most polluted US neighborhoods haven't changed. So while some communities benefit from improved environmental standards, others have not reaped these benefits. And this racism is really embedded into the structure of our country through zoning laws, health inequities, food scarcity, and political disenfranchisement. And then when you get to climate change, it's really no surprise that low-income communities are more likely to be exposed to climate change threats like flooding, storms, and droughts due to inadequate housing and infrastructure. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the coronavirus, which is bringing a lot of these inequities to head. Studies have found links between exposure to air pollution and worse outcomes from COVID-19, including higher mortality rates. In the US, Black American deaths from COVID-19 are nearly 2 times greater than would be expected based on their share of the population. And in a few states, the rate is 3 or more times higher, which is like absolutely horrible. And then in March 2020, we saw that the Environmental Protection Agency suspended pollution enforcement. Basically, they put out a temporary policy that said that they wouldn't be enforcing pollution regulations. Companies would not be expected to follow regulations during the coronavirus. So we can see that corporations play a large role in these interconnected issues. A very popular study showed that just 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. Corporations fuel the climate crisis through emissions. Environmental harms exacerbate and replicate inequities. And we know that under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, companies do have a responsibility to respect human rights. And this includes rights like the right to life, health, food, water, and non-discrimination, all of which are really integral to climate and the environment. Next slide, please. So Mary Beth shared about the kind of tools of shareholder advocacy that we use, and I'm going to share about how we plan to use those tools to further the goal of this initiative. And so we see all of these issues that we've been bringing up, human rights, racial justice, and climate change, as really interconnected. So we feel that it's important to address these simultaneously. We want to encourage companies to respond to both the climate crisis and the realities of many communities as we work towards a just transition. So there are really 2 prongs to our goal. Our first prong of the goal is advocating for a just transition to a low carbon economy. And so what does this look like? What are we going to be asking companies to do? So I've listed some examples below. Some of the asks will be setting time-bound science-based goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and align with the Paris Agreement to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Another aspect is embedding respect and sustainability for workers and communities in climate policies. This is about not leaving anyone behind. So that kind of looks like communities currently dependent on taxes from fossil fuel facilities and operations, workers who should be retrained for green jobs with strong labor standards. And the second prong of this goal is to advocate for robust corporate human rights due diligence around climate change and environmental justice. So some examples of what we would ask for is monitoring, reporting, and reducing emissions or health hazards. That's so communities can know what's in their air, what's in their water, so they have access to information that can keep their families safe. It's also respecting the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. That's a way that Indigenous peoples protect the right to self-determination. And another thing is respecting human rights defenders, so people who are defending water, fighting against discrimination, protecting from health hazards. And on the right there, you see our vision that we want companies to operate in a rights-respecting manner with accountability to communities and stewardship to the environment and climate. Next slide, please. So based on our affiliates company holdings, we identified 8 companies in the 4 key sectors we felt not only had a significant contribution to the climate crisis, but also whose operations have significant impacts on the communities in which they operate. So our company focus list I have listed here is Dow, Freeport McMoran, General Electric, Honeywell, Newmont, NextEra Energy, Southern Company, and Southern Copper Corporation. This is going to be complementary to other investor engagements with these companies and within the sectors. In this moment, we're really trying to bring a new kind of holistic and interconnected way of looking at these issues like climate change to shareholder advocacy coordinated within this larger community of advocates and investors. So we completed extensive research and chose 8 companies based on factors like profile of emissions, history of contamination, as well as apparent inadequate governance and oversight of human rights and environmental issues. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the sector focuses quickly and show what this initiative may look like in action, illustrate how our focus corporations fit into the interconnected web of impacts. The first sector is chemical manufacturers, which are some of the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and are amongst the most dangerous to health. Dow Inc. is our company focus here. We've listed out some of the impacts that we're really concerned about, like harmful byproducts of chemical manufacturing. Dow's headquarters in Michigan is a Superfund site with the EPA for dioxin pollution. And there's also a huge risk to damage to natural resources that impact communities of color and indigenous communities. Next slide, please. Our next sector is conglomerates. They are multi-industry companies often associated with materials used in clothing and technology, but are linked to widespread toxic environmental pollution, disproportionately impacting communities of color. I know many on the call are familiar with PCB contamination in the Hudson River and Housatonic River. Another concern is PFAS, or forever chemicals that contaminate public water supplies. I know here in New Jersey, it's estimated that 1 in 5 residents have their water polluted with PFAS. Another concern is plastic pellet pollution, which can absorb toxins from the water and transfer into human diets. And these environmental and health impacts are often not disclosed, and they often compound on legacy pollution that exists. And we see a kind of pattern with companies that Brighton kind of outlined, where they pollute, they pay a fine, and they move on. And the communities are still faced to deal with these consequences, and often there's no remedy in the long term. Next slide, please. Our third sector focus is on utilities, which is a key sector for ensuring our transition to a zero carbon economy and ensuring that that transition integrates justice for communities, workers, and other marginalized groups. So this goes back to the not leaving any communities or workers behind as we transition. We should be centering their livelihoods in company climate policies. Other risks that we have been tracking with these 2 companies, Southern Company and NextEra Energy, are investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. The Mountain Valley Pipeline, the Sabal Trail Pipeline are examples of projects that not only risk water, but have been heavily protested for running right through overburdened and disadvantaged Black communities. And these same communities are ones facing some of the worst health outcomes for COVID-19 right now. And adding additional burdens to these communities has been described as a potential environmental justice disaster. Other risks we've looked at is legacy pollution from coal ash and other rights of violating Indigenous peoples while building renewable energy infrastructure. Our last sector focus is mining and extractives. This is not only a major contributor to the climate crisis, but also gives rise to serious and widespread human rights abuses and threats. Operations often surround agricultural communities, which can be devastated by water pollution, lack of access to water, air pollution that threatens health of livestock and therefore livelihoods. And many companies operate within Indigenous communities and have been accused of land grabbing and refusing to respect the right to FPIC. Violence, threats, and abuse against human rights defenders is another key risk. Next slide. And so, as I hope I have illustrated, companies on this initiative focus list have a really large footprint, not only on the climate, but on communities. And as investors, we can offer a unique leverage to impacted communities And we aim to work in alignment and solidarity with the goals of community groups on the front lines of these impacts. And so I've listed kind of what our collaboration might look like with community groups, being able to bring communities' experiences or impacts to the attention of company management, encouraging companies to meet with community groups directly. Mary Beth also mentioned shareholder proposals and attending company annual meetings where we can lend proxies to individuals so they can ask questions to the CEO and the board and bring our leverage to public campaigns. This also allows investors to better assess whether or not a company's management systems and policies are really working to prevent, mitigate, and remedy human rights violations. We see a lot that companies will claim that they have robust stakeholder engagement, that they are managing human rights violations and remedying them at their operations. And for the communities that live fence line communities to these operations, they know that that's not the case. That's not their lived experience. So this is about making the space for those communities to be able to raise their voice to these powerful companies. And a key question that we have been facing, investor advocates for social justice, while we do this work, is examining how white supremacy culture may influence this. And so we want to make sure, we know that white supremacy culture can manifest even in our own organizations. The systems that we talked about in this kind of problem slide, like racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, disproportionate pollution, are designed so that these communities and partners are overburdened with numerous crises, they're underfunded and disenfranchised. So damaging cultural norms and characteristics that may manifest in our own work can many times can just undermine the goals of our organization. So we realize that doing this work requires some self-reflection and a new way of looking at investors as part of these interconnected issues that we're trying to address. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Beth if you have anything to add on that, or back to Sister Carol. Thanks.
Thanks, Jillianne. I'll just add in the last point of white supremacy culture. Like investors are stakeholders with quite a lot of power. They have invested capital, and we recognize that we may be engaged in like power hoarding or gatekeeping or paternalism, like pretending we're here to like speak for the voiceless. And we're trying really to be intentional about how we look at partnerships and relationship building with community stakeholders so that we are also not replicating the harms and the ways that companies disenfranchise and disempower communities when we ourselves are looking to try to address the harms that companies are causing. So just know that this is work we're doing with deep self-reflection and a recognition that there's a lot of work to be done even internally. And welcome everyone into this space as we examine it. So with that, I will transition straight to Julia, if that's okay.
Thank you. Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement is very much involved in bringing Laudato Si to life in the New York City area. And for those of you that are not familiar with us, we are a local chapter of Global Catholic Climate Movement. And we're coordinated by a team of Catholic leaders from various parishes and organizations in the New York City metro area. We network, engage, organize, and sustain one another spiritually while addressing climate change, integral ecology, and care for creation. We strive to be a voice to promote dialogue and to work towards a culture of encounter and to take action. And some of our past actions have included Laudato Si and Amazon Synod workshops, climate crises film series, retreats, promoting Season of Creation events. We do a Lenten carbon fast. We participate in the local shore cleanup on the Hudson River. We participate in marches, petition, and letter campaigns for environmental policy and legislation. And there is our email contact there. Okay. We also have one of our most recent actions is a declaration of celebration and commitment. And this is in honor of the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. And this is just a commitment we've been asking people to sign. We've been working through parishes and other groups. I'm going to leave it for you to read. It's basically about being reflective, taking Sabbath time, and what kind of practices people are going to do to help reduce carbon footprint, etc., and being solidarity with others. And then lastly, what I was asked to do as an invitation to this group was to consider some of the things that Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement may do in terms of collaborating, potential collaborations with IASJ and also with ROAR. First of all, locally, there's the natural gas pipeline that is going to Brownsville, Brooklyn, and it's bringing frack gas to the liquefied natural gas operation at the Greenpoint Station facility. This is something that was actually done. They started digging and doing things National Grid without really letting the neighborhood know about it. There's been a lot of issues with this about the impact, both environmentally and on the neighborhood. The second is a proposal to renovate the polluting peaker power plant in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Peaker plants are power plants that take over when the electricity use level gets very, very high and they need to kick in to produce more electricity. But rather than doing what they want to do in terms of renovating it, we're suggesting that they really invest in renewable energy rather than kind of rebuilding an old structure. The last of the local would be partnering with organizations that are currently working on asthma-connected environmental hazards in New York City. And we know that that's a big area, particularly in the Bronx, etc. Next slide, please. And on the national and international level, there's several things that are going on. One of the big issues right now is Hydro-Quebec. They're an energy company up in Canada, and they have a proposal to run an electricity line all the way down the Hudson River to New York City. There's already a contract in Maine and Massachusetts with this, and they've been trying to talk to city and state officials here in New York to do this. It's going to have a great impact, not only on the river itself, but also particularly on the indigenous communities that have been involved in this for a long time. The other item, which is very big, is deforestation in the Amazon. We've seen what's been going on in terms of logging and mining and setting fires and all kinds of things, particularly impacting the indigenous people there. Infrastructure companies that are building pipelines for frack gas and dirty tar sands oil. And some of that was spoken about, but we also have those issues down south with mining and whatnot. Fossil fuel companies that are building plastic production plants. And this is happening in many, many places I think a lot of people may not even be aware of. And lastly, chemical and manufacturing and corporate conglomerates that are producing environmental hazards to air, soil, and water, impacting community health. And as I say, these are just ideas for consideration, and our groups will have to get together for further dialogue and determine how we can all best work together to address some of these. So thank you very much.
Julia, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Brighton and Jillianne and Mary Beth. I'm going to invite us. In fact, I think I just typed into the chat box, begin to think up questions or insights that you might have. So perhaps, I don't know if anyone has raised a hand yet. I don't see, but maybe while we're waiting for a person to raise a hand, either to give a comment or maybe to ask a question, I'm just wondering, from what we've heard as part of the planning group, anything come to mind? In fact, have you had any new insight or a new idea that kind of surfaced as you were listening? And even did you learn something new? Because that was part of today, the learning, you know, were there some new things that we might have learned from each other?
And this is Mary Beth speaking. I'm just going to reiterate, if anyone has a question, you can enter it into the Q&A box. where you can type it in, or if you raise your hand and indicate that you want to be unmuted, we can also unmute you so you can ask your question directly. Okay, I'm gonna unmute Betty and Jaster.
Okay,
Betty,
thanks.
can you hear me? Can you?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I just wanted to ask, related to the Voices for the Voiceless, what about engaging the voiceless to speak for themselves at those kind of meetings? Have you worked on any aspects of that?
Yeah, Betty, and this is Mary Beth.
Instead of speaking for them, you know.
Thank you so much for that question. I think for us, that's exactly what we try to do, to encourage companies to go directly to community stakeholders, to conduct impact assessments, to meet regularly with relevant stakeholders. What we can try to do is have our advocacy informed by those perspectives, but I think what we don't want to do is displace those perspectives. And I'll invite any other speakers, Brighton or Jillianne or Carol, Julia, if there's anything else you want to add.
Well, I think what I might just add, and there might be someone who's listening who has a better way of expressing it than I do, but any of the groups that I belong to, whether it be ROAR or Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement, or even, I know when we've gone to so many rallies, because we have been involved in so many events, it is hard sometimes for some of us. The way it is we have many white middle class people involved. And so it is a challenge in terms of how do we really join with and put ourselves in places where we develop stronger relationships with the people of color and the people whose communities have been really affected. That can be a challenge, I think, for some of our groups. Someone else might be better able to express that.
I've seen experiences in Colorado of a group living among the people in that same neighborhood where there is so much pollution and so much indignities rendered on the living situations of people. And they started having groups come in, you know, to talk together about their own experiences. They had to dig up, I forget how many feet of every single home in that area's soil and replace it with good soil because of the pollutants that had happened. But they trained the people to speak their stories so that they could bring solid experience to it, not just hearsay or, you know, whatever. So that's just one idea.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question entered into the Q&A box from Rita. Do the groups opposed to the frack pipeline have an alternative proposal? I'm interested in supporting specific alternatives.
Sure. Was that talking about the fracking and pipelines that Julia brought up, or the ones we talked about in our initiative focus?
Probably generally on the low carbon transition, and then if there are specific alternatives.
Sure, yeah, I think what we're aiming for with companies is we do want them to transition away from fossil fuels, and that includes these pipelines, which are really locking in fossil fuel infrastructure for decades to come. And so alternatives to that would be more of renewable energy infrastructure, and not just renewable energy, but equitable renewable energy that respects the rights of communities that they're putting up this infrastructure in, and as well as jobs created with this new infrastructure that have fair labor rights, that have good wages and are unionized. So I think that's the kind of alternative we're looking at, from fossil fuel infrastructure to more renewable and equitable infrastructure that will set up our country and our whole global community to transition to a low carbon economy.
Julia, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, yes, you actually kind of took the words out of my mouth in terms of getting them to actually get more involved in renewable energy, solar power, wind, etc. And I think during this time of COVID, when people are really starting to examine what's gone on with the economy and how to boost the economy as well as health of a community, there are many ways to do this by promoting green jobs, training people in these communities. Solar One, I know, is doing it right now in New York. But it's definitely to get them away from these fossil fuel and high carbon output types of energy, and to really encourage renewable energy. And I think that's kind of the best way to go.
Thanks. And Brighton, is there anything you wanted to add, either in response to that question or others, or in reaction to any of the presentation?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the question that Beth raised concerning working with communities to amplify voices from those that might be affected, from minority communities or communities of color. From my own experience, I see that organizations such as advocates, investors for justice, and the Catholic Association are all working together to create that streamlined voice, that common voice. Having worked in communication and the media, I see that collecting stories, human interest stories of those that are affected, and creating a way through which we can have a more common voice, because people that might be affected by these challenges we are speaking about might be affected in different ways. But we also need institutions that are passionate and have a heart of the community to be able to unify all these voices. So all that's to say, all these well-intended organizations are working towards unifying this voice of those that are affected, and making sure that we have a more common declaration of what we want.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I guess what that sparks in me, Brighton, is my experience with the Global Catholic Climate Movement, with the webinars that they've had during the season of creation, with the global prayers that they have. I've been able to meet people in Uganda, Nigeria, and in so many different parts of the world, and hear their experiences and hear what's happening. And to me, their stories become very personal to me, and somehow then the work that I'm doing, it's not just an intellectual thing, but it's very much more of a mind, body, spirit thing. And I do think, for me, some of the work that we're doing, and I don't know, for those of us that are listening and are on this webinar, when you're working for systemic change, it is a challenge. It is hard, because it does involve a real personal conversion and a personal transformation that somehow we need then to be motivated and inspired. And it's the relationships that we have with one another, that we build with one another. And certainly the stories that we get to know from people, our colleagues, and frontline people on the front line who are experiencing it, that help us continue to move forward and keep on going.
I see that John Lipscomb is on the line and has his hand raised. I know we're just about at time, but maybe we can move forward just a few more minutes. So John, I'm going to unmute you, and you'll be able to talk.
Thank you.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you. And I enjoyed and learned a lot from the presentation. A couple perspectives. I'm actually on our patrol boat. I work for Riverkeeper for the Hudson River. We serve the river. I'm actually on our patrol boat now on day 13 of a 2-week patrol, and we're in Kingston. So I'm delighted to hear you have identified the Champlain Hudson Power Express and Hydro-Quebec as a problem. I'm because I work for the Hudson, that's sort of the edge of the world. The earth is flat for me. The Hudson is the whole world for us, and it's more than we can handle, our efforts to protect the river. I urge you all, your organizations, to take fast action in regards to the Hydro-Quebec project. I will share with Carol, Sister Carol, a link from the North American Mega Dam Resistance Alliance. These are people working to fight these hydropower projects. The damage that's going to be caused in Canada has been caused and will be caused in Canada is beyond words. These giant impoundments behind these enormous dams, hydroelectric dams, flood hundreds up to 1,000 square miles of boreal forest. As that boreal forest rots, it releases methane, and these reservoirs release more climate change gases in form of methane than a coal plant for their initial life. They're not green. They are a fraud. We should never refer to hydro as a green power source. There's a big difference between renewable power, which is hydro, and sustainable power. The only way you can call hydropower sustainable is if you value a living river at zero. Because the minute you build dams, fish migration, sediment transport, dissolved oxygen, all those, the aquatic habitat of that river goes off a cliff. And so we mustn't pretend that hydro is sustainable green energy. It's a horror for the environment. So I urge you, in the past we've worked with Roar, and Roar has written the governor of New York, and to good effect. And Governor Cuomo, I can provide background materials, but it's a very simple letter. It says the Hydro-Quebec project is a crime against the environment and the indigenous people of Quebec, of Labrador especially, and it's a crime against the Hudson River. The electromagnetic frequency produced by the cable is likely to alter the migration of sturgeon and herring and shad, and the river is at the bottom in terms of its aquatic life. The numbers of fish in the Hudson have never been lower. We are poised to start turning that around and restoring more robust populations. But right now, at the very bottom of the curve, we're going to kick the river when it's down. So I urge you to speak now, because if Hydro-Quebec doesn't get a contract from New York City, it will not be able to get and the whole project fade away, which would be a godsend for the Hudson and for Eastern Canada. The second thing, just a thought for you. We constantly are trying to figure this out. How do we actually approach our relationship with the planet in a shared way? And one thing I would love for you all to consider is to banish the word natural resource. When you call a forest or a river a natural resource, as we all have, you doom that river in use. That's not exactly why it's here. And so I urge you all to think of the environment as a brother and a sister sharing the planet. And so we have rivers where the miners use it as a natural resource to flush away their waste. We have rivers like the Hudson where overfishing has decimated fish populations because they thought of it as a natural resource. None of them thought of the river as an ecosystem or a forest or as an ecosystem with rights to survival and success, same as all of us. And if we think of the earth that way, then the miners don't get to abuse it, and overfishing doesn't happen, And we don't log the Adirondacks for timber, and it changes everything when we don't think of the earth as a natural resource, as a consumable for us. Thank you.
John, it's Carol, and thank you very, very much. I'm so glad that you could join us. And I typed into the chat box how you gave us a really great example of how we live integral ecology in terms of looking at a living river and all its parts and all that. So thank you. I am conscious that it is after 3. I know there are some questions. And by the way, one of the questions was, and John will give us the link. So everyone on this webinar will get a link to more information on this hydro power initiative and how we might advocate against it. I'd like to ask Mary Beth, should we say that these other questions will be answered via email, or I don't know if we could answer them very quickly.
Sure, a few more questions came in specifically about the impact of shareholder advocacy. I will commit to follow up by email with those of you who asked those questions. I would just say in sum, as investors, we are at a level that's very disconnected from the grassroots impact. So it's hard for us to know, did someone's life on the ground change? Did those communities in Zambia get access to cleaner water as a result of the advocacy? And that's why we see partnerships as so critical for really knowing if our work is changing and if companies are hearing directly from stakeholders impacted. So that question, I think, illustrates a really important opportunity to frame the closing where we can ask for systems change and policy change at the company level. And we need to work in partnership with community stakeholders to ensure that at the end of the day, something was made better, people were made whole, the water was valued, the right to health was realized, the right to clean air was made real. And concretely, yes, of course, we do have examples and we'll follow up with those. But I think more holistically, what we're really talking about is synergizing our work and helping to collectively bring voice to these issues at the company level, at the public policy level. And in closing, I'll share, before I turn to you, Sister Carol, that to all the participants of the webinar, we'll make sure to send the slides and the recording, and we'll address the specific questions that were asked. We continue to invite you to work with us, to collaborate, to brainstorm if you had a good idea of a specific company or project or something you feel like we omitted in the conversation. Please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us. And I'll turn to you, Sister Carol, and just a note of gratitude to everyone for participating today.
Yes, and I just want to encourage, especially members of the 3 groups who were involved in planning for this webinar. Please make sure you contact and be in touch with us. If you're not on the steering committee, if you don't come to the ROAR meetings, and you can always email Jillianne and Mary Beth if you're part of IASJ. So because this is only a beginning. This is really a beginning in terms of how do we look at possibilities for connecting more and strengthening relationships. And so I guess I just want to thank, Mary Beth and Jillianne and Brighton and Julia, because this did take time and effort and energy, and there were other people involved in helping to plan this. And I want to thank very much the members of the 3 groups who are representing here, because they have long histories and a lot of work, and we're going to move together and not in silos, hopefully, or together, strengthen our relationships. And I guess I just want to say that I believe that all 3 of our groups are working towards creating a future that is life-sustaining and generative for the children of today and future generations. And so we're just very grateful for all the work that's being done, and give thanks for all of you, and look forward to our coming together. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.